here's the thing with that. That is the point that I wanted to bring up here, is that, and I made that point mentioned already, is that no one who is arguing to keep merit and how important merit is and figuring out objective standards to work with is arguing against having diversity in science. That's not the argument. Okay, so you all may recall last week or the week before, I think, the In Defense of Merit article, this one here, if you may recall, with the 29 authors who put in that piece, which I reviewed on this channel in depth, mind you. It was 2 hours of focus on it. But of course, there are responses that have come up in here that I find interesting, and probably the most interesting one comes from Science Magazine itself, from the editorial, one of the editors actually in here in particular, writing the following: in Matters Who Does Science. Scientific research is a social process that occurs over time with many minds contributing. But the public has been taught that scientific insight occurs when old white guys with facial hair get hit on the head with an apple or go running out of bathtubs shouting Eureka. So, immediately right there, I have to stop and ask the question, is, somehow I don't think that's true. And I would like to see the citation that you can point to with this to say that's what people are taught. I know I was never taught that as a kid, or even in college. Never was taught that. So yeah. Yeah. That's not how it works, and it never has been. Rather, scientists work in teams, and those teams share findings with other scientists who often disagree and then make more refinements. Yes and no. I would make an addendum to that, in that scientists do work in teams, but they also can work alone. Some of the studies that you find, though it's less and less frequent as time has gone on, have one author. So you can say that that scientist did all of the work from the conception to the research and the writing by themselves, potentially, in that case, or maybe with input of very, very, very few that perhaps get a mention in the acknowledgments. So I don't entirely agree with that particular statement. Then those findings are placed in the scientific record for even more scientists to examine and to produce further adjustments. Eventually, theories become knowledge. All along the way, these scientists are conspicuously and magnificently human, with all the assets and flaws that humans possess. And that means that who those individuals are and their backgrounds they bring to their work have a profound influence on the quality of the end result. Making an assumption that the background has a profound influence, because I notice he provides no citation on that front. He's making a presumption that the background of a scientist has a profound influence on the quality of the end result. I would say can have. And the reason I would say can have is I have seen studies that are done by folks who are considered the top of their field, and they were garbage studies. A la John Money. And then there are others from lesser known folks that I have thought myself were high quality. Now, admittedly, what I'm saying is anecdotal because it's my own experience with that. So, fair point, if you're pointing that out. But I would suspect, I would take a suspicion that the assumption of the background, growing up in elite background versus not, growing up in different socioeconomic statuses and all that kind of thing, can have. But it doesn't mean it has to have. Saying it has a profound influence on the quality of the end result, that's an assumption. And I don't think it's necessarily a very good one. And as to the rest of the paragraph, yeah, we submit things to each other for disagreement and what have you. That is part of the part of the point with organized skepticism. In particular, we submit things to each other. The Mertonian norm of organized skepticism: we submit things to each other for serious critiques, and only the best of the best rises to the top. And with again, I point to Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge because it is an excellent does an excellent job of describing scientific practice, not just scientific practice, but really the whole thing with liberalism itself in terms of classical liberalism, and how it meets out knowledge and truth seeking with regards to objective reality, in amongst other things. Now, I think it's after this paragraph that is where I think this particular piece in Science, it runs off the rails. It has somehow become a controversial idea to acknowledge that scientists are actual people. I should like to know where he thinks that's what he thinks is that the case, because we'll get to that in a second. For some, the notion that scientists are subject to human error and frailty weakens science in the public eye. But scientists shouldn't be afraid to acknowledge their humanity. Individual scientists are always going to make a mistake eventually, and the objective truth that they claim to be espousing is always going to be revised. Claim to be espousing. When this happens, the public understandably loses trust. The solution to this problem is doing the hard work of explaining how scientific consensus is reached, and this process corrects for the human errors in the long run. So, two things. I think that the editor here is not wrong. Is not wrong with the notion that sometimes folks are not taught very well about the whole scientific process in terms of the collective body of scientists, and you hopefully reaching that consensus position, a natural consensus position, mind you. And along that line, objective truth they claim to be espousing. It's an interesting turn of phrase, actually, but for some, the notion that and what have you. But my real thing with this is that who said it's nobody that I know, nobody that I can find has said that we shouldn't acknowledge that scientists are humans. I'm trying to think of somebody who said that, we shouldn't acknowledge that scientists are actual people. A raging debate has set in over whether the backgrounds of backgrounds and identities of scientists change the outcomes of research. One view is that objective truth is absolute and therefore not subject to human influences. The science speaks for itself is usually the mantra of this camp, but the history and philosophy of silence argue strongly to the contrary. For example, Charles Darwin made contributions to the most important idea in biology, but his book, The Descent of Man, contained many incorrect assertions about race and gender that reflected his adherence to prevalent social ideas of his time. Thankfully, evolution didn't become the knowledge of the day Darwin proposed it, and it was refined over the decades by many points of view. More recently, pulse oximeters that measure blood oxygen levels were found to be ineffective for dark skin because they were initially developed for white patients. These examples and countless more in between reveal how much work needs to be done to strengthen the scientific community and the public understanding of the process. So, the link here is for this article, in which he basically is making the assertion that the In Defense of Merit article here that the In Defense of Merit article is saying that objective truth is absolute and therefore not subject to human influences. So, the thing about that claim is that's not what the article said. That is absolutely not what the article said. In the slightest. In fact, I will go point it out in a few places. Hold on a sec. use a control F to find it a little bit more quickly. Let's see. How to apply merit caveats, pitfalls, and good practices. Judgment may be affected by personal preferences, blind spots, and biases. Oh, wait a minute. Is something a little human. Yeah. Although subjective judgment should play an important role in evaluations of merit, we recognize that they are also most vulnerable to biases. How can the potential for bias be mitigated? However, the key is that focusing on the importance of the finding and the strength of the evidence can limit bias. In here, that basic assertion right there, and actually this is even more important one. The universalism section here is actually really, really interesting in here, because I feel like the editor of Science and his basic argument here is an extension of the everyone is biased kind of thing. That's not unknown. And in fact matter, everybody acknowledges it. This is the thing. For those folks who, like, for example, take the position of the in defense of merit article here, no one discounts that scientists are human and do potentially have their own biases. No one discounts that. This is what I don't quite understand. Such analysis is okay. More examples of the ideological subversion of science relevant to physics and chemistry were discussed in a recent viewpoint. Such analysis is often dismissed with vague deflections such as, quote, everything is political and, quote, everyone is biased. There is an element of truth to these declarations which can help raise awareness of the potential of scientists to have biases, including biases on politicized topics, and help to minimize such biases. However, those making these arguments often use them to impose their own ideological agendas on what can be studied and what kind of answers are permissible. It is this sense of the politicization of science that we categorically oppose. So, I'm going to make a point here that I do think the editor here misrepresented the authors of the In Defense of Merit article, because that is not what they said. They didn't say that there's not human influences in science. Now, the notion that objective truth is real and that it is knowable, that is a fundamental assumption of doing a science. Then that's what you're working towards with each study that is, provisional of the truth, and then you refine it, even as the editor of Science here just indirectly claimed himself in the other two paragraphs. So this is what kind of bugs me with this, because you're kind of admitting that objective truth is there and is absolute. But you're saying objective truth is not subject to... You're saying the argument... He's saying the argument against... the argument he's saying here, is that objective truth is absolute but not subject to human influences. Therefore not subject to human influences. It's hard to say it, and I think this was not a well-written sentence to begin with. But I do think what's going on here is that the argument is perhaps that objective truth, well, I hesitate to say this, but I wonder if this editor of Science is arguing that there is no such thing as objective truth, and then I wonder what you're doing as a scientist. Because, you have that assumption made, where is it? Oh, gosh, there was a great graphic in here that actually talked about this. Here it is, actually. Provisional truth is attainable. In here, objectivity, the rejection of any theory that cannot be proven or disproven by reality. You have to make a fundamental assumption that objective reality is there and is itself unchangeable, which means it is not subject to human influence. No one has argued, to the best of my knowledge, in the Defense of Merit article that people don't have their biases. But it is quite true if you are going from the base of being, science in a classical liberal sense, that that objective reality is there and doesn't necessarily change regardless of our human biases in one particular direction or another. There's a kind of a difference there. And so you're saying objective truth is not subject to human influences. You're saying, okay, one view is that objective truth is absolute and therefore not subject to human influences. Because, because of this kind of thing, yeah, because of this kind of approach, I feel like the editor is trying to say that objective truth is subject to human influences in his words. He doesn't come out and say it, but pairing those two together is very, very strange to me. The science speaks for itself is stupid because science is a process of getting at the truth. So no, the science doesn't speak for itself. Studies may speak for themselves in demonstrating something, and particularly a collection of studies that sort of build a natural consensus. But no, science doesn't speak for itself. It's a stupid phrase. So, and he's not wrong. To add another thing here, and you've heard me say this many times on this channel. Many points of view are important. Many perspectives are important, and that's how you do move science forward. It's like, oh, I got a different way of looking at it. You're wrong. This is why. Do your study, demonstrate so, and the knowledge base moves forward. So. A monolithic group of scientists will bring many of the same preconceived notions to their work, but a group of many backgrounds will bring different points of view that decrease the chance that one prevailing set of views will bias the outcome. This means that scientific consensus can be reached faster and with greater reliability. I don't necessarily agree with the statement, because if you have many divergent views on something, many different perspectives of looking at it, what you may also end up with is folks that are arguing over it for a length of time, for a great length of time. So there's no guarantee it's not necessarily going to be reaching a natural scientific consensus faster, just because somebody's background is different. And then there's also, still the assumption earlier made that, there's the assumption earlier made that the backgrounds, that the backgrounds have a profound influence on the quality of the end result, which is not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true at all. You can have somebody who comes from a very rich, has so much education, all this other kind of stuff, perhaps had parents who were in that discipline, all this other kind of thing, could be coming from that perspective and produce cruddy work. There's no cause and effect relationship there, that just because you come from one background, the end result and the quality of the research is also going to be better because you come from one background or another. There's not necessarily any proof for that. At least not that I can see. No, feel free to argue otherwise. And I mean, it could be, back to the other paragraph, could be that you get to it with reached faster and with greater reliability. It could also be that you end up with an argument until there are more studies done. I want to say that some of the things that we now hold as scientific consensus are perhaps took many, many, many decades previously to hash out. So I don't necessarily think it's the case that you can end up with that. Obviously, things can come fast, too. That's another thing. But not necessarily just because you have different groups of people. And I will point out, I don't have anything to point out there. I apologize. Went on a different train of thought for a second. It also means that the applications and implications will be more just for all. Statement with no citation A is my point there. Because you have no proof of that. I would like to know what the proof is of that it suddenly becomes more just for all. Just because you have somebody of different backgrounds which again, you have different backgrounds doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have different quality of end result. That doesn't mean that at all. How is this a threat to scientific rigor and the merit of discoveries? Okay. Which one is this? I forget. Oh, yes, the New York Times piece that is based upon the In Defense of Merit article. All right, I got to make a point on this one because, you know, how is having people of diverse backgrounds a threat to scientific rigor and the merit of discoveries? This is where I question whether or not the editor read the In Defense of Merit article, because that is not the argument that they made. The argument that they made is that you can get diversity of backgrounds, if you will. You can get diverse perspectives without lowering standards to achieve that. You can do that without, you don't necessarily need to sacrifice merit to achieve those desired outcomes. Fact matter, they talked about doing it themselves. I think they had a whole bunch of recommendations, if I remember correctly, down here. Well, they had a whole bunch of recommendations making sure that the ideological part of it was not thrown in there, but they do very much understand the biases thing, as I've said previously, and they did not make the argument against having diverse backgrounds. Indeed, the authors of that piece are some of the most diverse in backgrounds that you could find. In fact, the matter, I think it's in here in the supplement. Open file. Here we go. In the supplement, where they included the backgrounds of every single author in here from all different disciplines and walks of life, actually, in here. And that in itself, makes for some interesting things, just to say they got so many different backgrounds and disciplines in here. It was amazing to see them all. Amazing to see them all show up in here. It was fabulous. I don't think is it point in there, as I don't think I don't think they're against having people with diverse backgrounds. I don't think that's the argument they were making. The argument they were making is that you don't need to sacrifice standards to do that, to have strongly diverse backgrounds in the sciences. Unfortunately, we're nowhere near achieving these goals. Science has had enormous trouble building a workforce that reflects the public it serves. I've never seen a great definition for this. What does that mean? Reflects the public it serves. Now, I don't know what that means, to be honest. That's why I had to pause there. I'm just like, what does that actually mean, to reflect the public it serves? Numerous state governments are trying to make it more difficult, if not impossible, at public universities in their states, and even within the scientific community, there are efforts to derail the idea that it matters who does science. The soundbite "trust the science" has been circulating recently. This framing is unfortunate because the science, in this context, is usually a snapshot of ideas or facts in a particular moment, and often from the perspective of a small number of people or even one person. It would have been better to use the phrase "trust the scientific process," which would imply that science is what we know now, the product of the work of many people over time, and principles that have reached consensus in the scientific community through established processes of peer review and transparent disclosure. Now, I will say peer review is absolutely not perfect. Just as a side note there, scientists should embrace their humanity rather than pretending they're a bunch of automatons who instantly reach perfectly objective conclusions. That will be more work, both in terms of ensuring that science represents that humanity and explaining how it all works to the public. But in return, society will get better and more just science. Again, what the hell does that mean? More just. And it will allow scientists to immerse themselves in the glorious, messy process of always striving for a greater understanding of the truth. Okay, let me check on one thing real quick. I just wanted to find this real quick so I could highlight it also, because Jerry Coyne is one of the authors, and of course he wrote in response to Holden Thorp, who wrote the piece in Science. Yeah, so it's interesting because I have read through some of what Jerry wrote here, And so, yeah, there were, and yeah, and he goes into the thing about the issues with Holden's commentary on Charles Darwin's book and things like that. Um, in here, so yeah, he's gotten all that kind of thing, but it's there are lots. Oh yeah, here we go. The relevance at this point is, but it gives him a chance to note that the link he gives below is to our merit paper, which he mischaracterizes as making the claim that science is, quote, not subject to human influences. He appears to be making an argument that judging science and scientists on merit is at odds with the view that scientists are human and flawed. This is a false dichotomy that makes no sense. Thank you, Jerry. You said it better than I did when I was reading through it. But that is one of entirely the big points here. No, we know scientists have human biases. That was mentioned many, many, many times over in the article. Doesn't mean you intentionally bias it by introducing ideology in there, as well as, well, that doesn't mean you can't judge folks based upon merit. Particularly, how well does their stuff stack up against the real world? That is the ultimate test of merit. If you make a prediction, how well does it stand up against the real world? Yeah, this other paragraph right here, I wanted to give some of Jerry's stuff a look here. Thorp's real claim that better science can be done by diversifying the scientific community. He expands on that in the next paragraph by ignoring a question that's bloody obvious. If we are to diversify science by lowering the bar to entry, as Thorpe apparently admitted during the debate against Luana Barroja, and downgrading merit to bring in more diverse people, it's obvious that our conventional ideas of merit must be given lower priority. Luana notes this above. Thorpe's question, how is diversity a threat to scientific rigor and the merit of discoveries, is in fact discussed in our paper. Our argument is not that its diversity per se is a threat to merit, but that the drastic lowering of standards needed to attain full equity in science is a threat to merit, and we all recognize it. That is why, for example, grad schools are abandoning SATs and requirements for application, and why med schools do the same thing with MCAT tests. So here's the thing with that is the point that I wanted to bring up here, is that, and I made that point mentioned already, is that no one who is arguing to keep merit and how important merit is and figuring out objective standards to work with is arguing against having diversity in science. That's not the argument. The point is that you can have both. That you don't need to lower standards to achieve that. So that's the point that I want to make on this. I do think Holden is off kilter. He also jumps around a fair bit. I didn't like reading his article just because he seems to jump from point to point. It wasn't a very clear flow to me. But anyway, that's a whole other critique. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious, everybody.